Welcome back, everyone, to Lessons from the Frontline, a regular peer-to-peer learning series that offers an opportunity for you to interact directly with energy access innovators and to gain insights into their challenges and breakthroughs. The series is brought to you by Energy Catalyst, an Innovate UK program that supports innovators working in Africa and Asia to end energy poverty and to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7. You can learn more about Energy Catalyst at the gov.uk website. In this episode, we are joined by Emma Colenbrander. Emma is the head of the Global Distributors Collective, known as the GDC, a collective of over 200 last mile distributors. Before starting the GDC 2 years ago, she was co-founder of the last mile distribution company in India and worked in both government and civil society. Welcome, Emma. Welcome. I'm William Brent, the Chief Campaign Officer of Power for All, and I will be hosting today's discussion. No presentations, no panels, just us and you. A quick note before we start to the more than 150 people who registered to attend today. Thanks, first of all, for the many, many questions we've already received from you, and we will continue to take questions from you throughout. So please post your questions in the area marked Q&A at the bottom of your screens. We'll do our best to answer everything, but if we can't get to it all today, we'll try to do so afterwards. So with that, Emma, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we're going to break up the conversation today into 4 parts. It's going to be a quick market overview of the last mile distribution market, a look at what's happening with innovation around last mile distribution, the evolving needs of the last mile customer, and then we'll have a general grab bag of questions at the end. So let's kick it off with a question about GDC, a quick question about GDC. It's a new organization. Why was it created?
Yeah, so good question. As you say, we've been around for about 2 years now. And really we started because of 2 main reasons. So first of all, the last mile distribution sector is very fragmented. You have a large number of small companies who are operating very much in isolation. And that means that they're reinventing the wheel over and over again, and they're missing opportunities to learn from each other, and especially in a sector that is largely pre-competitive. I mean, these companies are not directly competing, they're operating in their own territories, and also missing the opportunity to take advantage of economies of scale. And then the second reason is really because we felt there was a real lack of understanding and appreciation for the role of last mile distributors for a whole range of reasons, but I think one being that last mile distribution doesn't fit nicely into a sector. Most last mile distributors operate across sectors and sell a variety of product categories. So I know this is a conversation today that's very focused on energy, but as I say, I mean, about 60 or 70% of our members sell more than one type of product, whether that's, water filters or improved cook stoves, sanitary napkins, and so on. And essentially that kind of lack of understanding about last mile distribution translates into a lack of support for distribution companies, both financial and non-financial. So we wanted to change that and tell the story of last mile distribution and put a spotlight on the sector to make sure that these companies can get the support that they need to make a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals.
And is energy, so it's not just energy, but is energy often the tip of the spear in reaching these customers?
Yeah, it is. So about 85% of our members do sell energy products. So whether that's lights, cook stoves, appliances, and particularly lights. Lights tends to be a very good entry product into a last mile community because they have such a clear value proposition. So a lot of companies will start by selling solar lights and then will branch out to sell other products to meet a variety of needs and to diversify their risk as well by offering a basket of goods.
And what's the size of this market that we're talking about, and what's the potential for GDC companies, do you think?
That's a really difficult question. So, I mean, if you look at the numbers of people who live without access to one or more basic products, I mean, we're talking about over 2 billion without access to clean cooking facilities, 860 million without access to electricity, nearly 800 million without clean water, and so on and so on. So those are big numbers. And obviously there's a lot of double counting there with people who are lacking more than one type of product or service. And I mean, another question when you look at the potential market is whether you only count quality products, because you might have people who sort of tick the box of access, but if they have access to an unreliable, poor performing product, or if they aren't able to replace or upgrade that product at end of life, then it's not meaningful access. So right now we have 200 members, last mile distribution companies who are selling beneficial products to these customers, and they're reaching on average 170,000 people. So cumulatively across our membership, that's a reach of about 34 million. So that is a tiny, tiny fraction of the market. So it's a huge market. And of course, last mile distributors aren't the only ones serving this market. You know, you've got MFIs and manufacturers who have their own proprietary distribution networks. You've got multinationals and so on. But, you know, distributors play this kind of unique role in serving kind of the hardest to reach and the poorest of the poor. But the potential market is massive and quite hard to quantify.
Do you have any multinational corporations in the GDC? Any MNCs in your GDC?
No, we don't. Part of our criteria is that there needs to be a focus on selling beneficial products. And so obviously, you know, multinationals, you know, like the Unilevers and Danones of this world, a lot of them are selling beneficial products, but it's not kind of their core business. The focus is more on FMCGs. So no, we don't have any multinationals in our membership at this time.
Okay, and then it's just to clarify, this is pretty much purely a B2C type of business model that your member companies have, not B2B, correct?
Well, it's both. I mean, a significant majority of our members operate a B2C model, and mostly they're working through networks of sales agents or through kind of community partners. But a minority do work B2B, and particularly through small retailers. And I think this is actually a huge opportunity that's not very well understood, because operating a sales agent network is really hard, it's expensive, and it's time intensive. Whereas, you know, if you tap into these kind of small retailers, these like mum and pop shops, you can operate a more efficient model. And these mum and pop shops, you know, typically they are the only existing sales channel in last mile regions. They already have a physical presence. They already have like trusted relationships with their customers. So right now, you know, these type of shops are not very often selling beneficial products. They're mostly selling, you know, the well-known sort of fast rotation products. And that is for very good reason, because of their, you know, limited working capital, because they don't necessarily have kind of the skills or the capability to be educating consumers about these type of products. But it is this kind of untapped opportunity. And we do have a few members, you know, like S-Mart, who operate in India, who are operating B2C. And I think it's something we're interested in exploring further and supporting distributors to do more of.
Do you mean B2B or B2C?
B2B.
Okay, I thought so. So very good. So a reminder, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. So you released, Emma, your first last mile distribution state of the sector report last year. Can you just give a very quick highlight of what the headline was from that? Yes.
So this was a very exciting report. It was the first time that the last mile distribution sector had been kind of mapped holistically. So it was quite comprehensive, and I'm not going to go through the whole report, but I guess the two pieces that were really exciting for me. So I think first of all, this really helped us to understand in a lot more depth who last mile distributors really are, because they are largely invisible and they're not well understood. So I think it validated that distributors are really reaching the lowest income parts of the population. So we found that more than 75% of customers who are being reached by last mile distributors live below the poverty line on less than $3.20 a day. And 44% of customers served by distributors live in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 a day. So they really are reaching kind of the hardest to reach parts of the market. And we also found that we kind of dispelled the myth that exists about distributors, which is that they're selling, you know, cheap, low quality products and kind of dumping and running. And we found that that's not true, that distributors are really committed to quality, both in terms of product and services. So 70% of distributors offer consumer financing and 65% offer warranties. So that was quite important to demonstrate as well. And then the second piece that I found interesting about this report was that we were able to break the last mile distribution sector into categories, because it is a very diverse sector and members have very different business models. And so today we tend to talk about distributors falling into three main categories. And so the first is experimenting distributors who are young, early stage, they're still figuring out their models, which vary significantly. And there's a lot of churn in that category because you have a lot of companies opening and closing. The second category is what we've called sort of fast growth distributors, who are those distributors who they're reaching for scale, they're focusing on getting their products into the hands of as many consumers as possible. They tend to operate for-profit models, and they're playing a really important role in making the sector more commercially attractive and demonstrating that path to profitability. So guys like Easy Solar and Mwezi would be kind of examples of those type of distributors. And then the third category of distributors is what we've called small and stable distributors. And these guys try to achieve impact in multiple ways. So yes, obviously they care about getting products to consumers, but they also care about supporting local salespeople and creating jobs, and they care about the ecosystems that they operate in. So they tend to go for depth of impact rather than sort of breadth. And they often have a very strong social mission. So they're deliberately focusing on really hard areas with products that are harder to sell. And only a slim majority are for profit models. And also, about half of them generate income through things other than the sale of products. So they do stuff like field test products for companies, or they do awareness raising campaigns or training programs or whatever. So they create value for the sector in a whole lot of different ways around learning and advocacy and innovation and reaching the poorest. And so someone like a Solar Sister would be sort of an example of a small and stable sort of social enterprise. And I think it's kind of tempting to conclude that like one group is better or more important than the other. But I think what we found is they both play very complementary roles in addressing the last mile challenge. Yeah, sorry, that was a bit long, but I think it's quite interesting to kind of break the sector into categories, and it sort of helps us to understand these companies a little bit better.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, which I'd be interested in digging into just a bit, is this notion that, you know, many of these companies are reaching the hardest to reach. And I think we're already seeing that, you know, SDG 7, access to universal electrification, is struggling to meet its goals by 2030, in part because many of the hardest to reach can't afford the types of solutions that many energy companies are trying to sell. So beyond just sort of delivering products, what role do last mile distributors have to play in creating, you know, consumer financing options, or stimulating demand, or raising awareness? Is there a role for last mile distributors to play there, especially on the finance part?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I say, a substantial majority of distributors are providing consumer financing. And in doing so, you know, they're often helping create credit history for customers who previously have had no credit history. And they are playing an important role in raising awareness of these kind of products as well, because often they are the only companies that are operating in these communities. This is often the first time that these customers have seen this type of product or become aware of this type of product. And so by giving people the chance to kind of touch and feel products and have an experience with a product, they are sort of creating trust, and they are building demand, which means that, you know, other kinds of companies can ultimately step into these markets and sustainably serve these types of consumers. And then, of course, you know, they do play a role in job creation. So, and that's through sort of all parts of the value chain. From, you know, manufacturing all the way through to after sales service, and because they are generally operating through sales agent networks who are sort of hyper local, and often, you know, there's a lot of evidence to show that women make particularly good sales agents. They do have an important impact in terms of job creation, particularly for women.
Great. So Bart Magura asks about the types of company you mentioned. Where he wants to know where you can find the State of the Sector report. Is it on Global Distributors Collective.org, or where would we find that?
It is, yeah, globaldistributorscollective.org, and it's under research and insights. We got a couple of reports there, but I think the State of Sector report is probably the best overview of the sector. And we have a list of all of our members on our website as well, so you can get a sense for who these companies are.
Great, there you go, Bart. So you know, you mentioned these three types of companies. For the experimenting type, and maybe for the others as well, is there any quick advice for those early stage distributors on how they can unlock greater scale? Have you seen certain practices that have worked well? Obviously, being well funded, having a good management team, or having a good team is important. But what advice would you give to someone who's trying to scale their business right now?
Yeah, so how do you turn yourself from an experimenting distributor into, I guess, one of the other categories? I mean, you've mentioned a couple. I guess specifically thinking about a last mile distribution business, I mean, one important piece of advice, I guess, is to really invest time in finding the right product and the right suppliers, and not taking shortcuts, because obviously, a quality product that performs and does what it says it's going to do is going to sell itself once it's in a community, and it's making that first sale in a community and sort of building that initial trust that's so challenging, and that's why the role of a distributor is so important. But if you've got the right product, the rest will happen, and not just kind of a quality product, but also having the right support and the right service from your supplier. And I think we see that when manufacturers and distributors have good partnerships, it's really, really, really good. So, distributors can have access to really good sales and marketing material. They get stock on time and they don't have problems with stock outs. They get support with training for their agents. They get good after sales support. Sometimes they get a line of credit, all that kind of stuff. And that contributes to a very mutually beneficial partnership. But if when the partnership doesn't work, it really doesn't work. And if a distributor doesn't have a product, then you don't have a business. So investing time in the right product and supplier would be one. And then I guess on the point of partnerships, the second piece of advice would be to really invest time in relationships with your funders. And in particular, I think for distributors, that means managing expectations of your funders. Because there's always going to be push to reach viability and to scale, but you cannot prove a last mile distribution model in a year. It takes time. It is really hard to make the unit economics of distribution work. Distribution businesses operate on trust and relationships with a very risk-averse customer base, and that just is not built overnight. So as a company, I mean, your job is to help your funders to understand that, and take them on that journey with you. So, don't make promises about being viable in 6 months' time.
Yeah. Well, and then of course we're dealing in a time that's unlike any other with COVID. So, that's what you just described is in a normal world, right? And we're not living in a normal world. So I'm wondering if you could just, before we dive into sort of what's happening on the innovation front in last mile distribution, if you can just talk briefly about how does a company survive COVID? Because my understanding is that many of the companies that have been worst affected by COVID are last mile distribution companies. And so who's been affected worse, and how do they survive?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it has been a particularly hard time for distributors. It's been hard for everyone, but distributors have been disproportionately hit. I mean, many of the people on this conversation will have seen the NDEV survey results that came out last month. And that paints a pretty bleak picture of the sector, but it does show that distributors are struggling more than most. So I think it was about 80% of distributors reported having a significant disruption to their business. And that's compared with about sort of 65% of all other company types. And about 40% of distributors are already in hibernation mode as compared to less than 20% of other company types. So distributors are being quite badly hit. And in saying that, that's not true across the sector. I mean, some distributors are experiencing kind of unprecedented demand and unprecedented sales. But for the most part, distributors are scaling back or ceasing operations completely. And I mean, I think what we're seeing is what's true again across the sector is that the companies that are able to adapt and are able to access some kind of relief funding are best placed to survive, and are quite effective in finding ways to sort of either innovate and do things differently over this period to retain some of their sales, or are are able to kind of just hibernate and just ride it out. And for some companies, things are opening up and they're resuming a level of sales that is akin to what they were before the crisis, but that's definitely a minority.
Yeah. And that you also have a COVID resource page on your website too, right? For companies that are looking for information on support, is that right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So before we jump into innovation, a question from Isaac Mwati from NORCAP, which is sort of related because I suppose you could imagine that humanitarian agencies are under even more stress now with COVID. And he wants to know why, his question is that most of the humanitarian agencies are distributing very low quality solar products. How can GDC assist in averting this to avoid, having a bunch of e-waste in a few months? Do you work with humanitarian agencies at all?
We don't really work with humanitarian agencies. A couple of our members are active in refugee settings, but a minority. I think it's an area of interest for a lot of members, but I think there's not a very good understanding of how they can or should start to work in those communities. So I think that's kind of a bridge that needs to be crossed. But you will have seen that Verasol have put out a really great database of quality verified products just in the last couple of months, which is a really great place for distributors and others to look at quality products and where they can source those products. So, I mean, I'd recommend taking a look at that if you haven't already.
Yeah, thanks. So yes, we're talking about a sector that's very fast evolving, fast moving. You did an innovation challenge in the past, I think maybe the first one last year, I'm not sure. But as we start to talk about innovation, what are you finding from these initial challenges? Are we talking about disruptive innovation? Are we talking about incremental innovation? What is the innovation story around last mile distribution?
Yeah, well, I mean, distributors have been working to address the same challenges for a long time. So just, challenges around how to make sure that products are affordable for last mile customers and how to assess consumer creditworthiness and manage default risk, how to, access finance and particularly working capital, and how to recruit and train and maintain a high touch sales force network. I mean, these are all challenges that distributors have been grappling with, since the sector was born. And even with COVID, I mean, these challenges the challenges of COVID are not new; they're just accelerated and exacerbated. So I think what that means is that when we are seeing innovations in the space, for the most part, they're not really radical. They are quite incremental. For example, a lot of companies are looking at how do we reorganize payment terms and delay payments for customers to make it easier for them to pay back their product. How do we diversify our sales channel so that we're selling not just through one type of partner, but also through other types of partners? How do we pivot some of our trainings to be more efficient and be delivered virtually or by phone instead of having to get everyone together in person? So it's those kind of, I think, incremental innovations that companies are looking at. But I do think that just because they're not radical, it doesn't make them less exciting, because if you take an incremental innovation and it's adopted by a very large number of companies, then that does become quite transformative.
Yeah, incremental innovation scaled it still makes a big impact.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so you're running a current challenge now as well, I believe. And I'm curious if you have an idea yet. I know that the results haven't been announced yet, but do you have any idea of what kind of applications you're receiving that are generating the most excitement?
Yeah, so I mean, we are still reviewing the applications, and the final shortlist is going to go to member voting in the next couple of weeks. So members will select the final innovations that they want to see piloted. But the range of ideas is really impressive. So, I mean, just to give you a sense of kind of the types of things that distributors are working on, I mean, there's a lot about digitization, digital marketing, customer service tools, assessing customer creditworthiness, lower cost, more efficient sort of sales management, software solutions, and so on. There's a lot around financing as well, both innovations for financing for distributors themselves and for their customers. a lot around product diversification, particularly for how we can blend the sales of beneficial goods and fast-moving consumer goods, which is kind of a nut that hasn't really been cracked yet. They do tend to operate quite different business models at this time. And then kind of ecosystem enabling ideas, like, for example, how do you help distributors to make better decisions about what markets to enter? So we've seen a pretty broad set of innovations come through, but quite a lot that I think is really, really interesting and is interesting for the wider sector, because a big part of our innovation challenge is that these ideas need to have a clear route to replicability and scale, and are not kind of to be held by individual companies, for their own competitive advantage.
There's a question from Oscar Mexico that sort of links back to your point around, what markets to enter. He wants to have a quick comparison, especially for beginners, about how do you assess the power of going after already existing customers versus an aggressive approach of using other new market penetration measures like persuasive marketing. Would you rather incentivize already existing customers to grow the network, or use persuasive marketing tools to do that?
Just repeat the question again.
Basically, do you try and grow your existing customer base, or do you use persuasive marketing? I'm not sure exactly what's meant by that, but advertising or push marketing to try and grow into new customers that aren't currently in your customer base, I think was the question.
I mean, so I think it very much depends on the model. And I mean, as I said earlier, I think we do see sort of two types of companies, and the fast growth companies are focused much more on, gaining new customers, and specializing in one type of product and then selling that product to a large number of people. So it is more about below the line marketing and word of mouth marketing about one product to a large number of people. But then we do see other types of companies who do have a focus on depth and look at penetrating their existing customer base by selling a variety of products and capitalizing on the existing relationships that they have. And I don't think one is better than the other. It's what works for that particular company. So I think both. Yeah,
I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned software, e-commerce, digitization. Is there any more sort of inside a sneak peek that you can provide in terms of what's coming in the next year?
I think you're going to have to wait and see till our winners are announced. But I mean, I will say that I think there's a lot of interest in and buzz around e-commerce at the last mile, and there are some very interesting examples of e-commerce that are emerging. But I mean, in practice, e-commerce is complicated and it is very different from current last mile distribution business models. And I think, we also have to accept that e-commerce just doesn't work in some markets where connectivity levels and digital literacy levels are really low. And we know some last mile distributors who have tried and failed to operate e-commerce models. So I think, there's a lot of buzz around it, and I think expectations are high that is where the sector is going, and there is an opportunity, but I think we also just need to manage those expectations a little bit.
So you're saying that there's not going to be there's not going to be an Amazon for beneficial products in last mile Africa? Last mile community for Africa?
Not coming out of our innovation challenge. Not yet.
Maybe a couple of years down the road.
Maybe.
We hope. Yeah. Okay. This is companies that are selling products that have to procure those products, and there's questions around what procurement challenges they face and what procurement innovations can address those challenges.
Yeah. So, I mean, the procurement challenges are pretty diverse, and I guess again, for the sake of this conversation, I think it's good to focus on energy and the off-grid solar space, and we've been doing quite a bit of research around procurement in off-grid solar, and I think what we're seeing is that distributors have challenges in accessing products for two main reasons. So first of all, is around selecting products. So distributors find it really hard to identify what products are best suited to their customers' needs, and they tend to find themselves stuck between two types of products. So the quality verified products that do perform really well, but they are expensive. And then the non-quality verified products, which are much more affordable, but are lacking in quality assurance. And distributors, tend to be sort of stuck between those two options. And then the second challenge is really about, well, how do you import that product? So once you've selected the product you want to sell, you often will have to import that product mostly from China, because there tends to be a lack of in-country stock, except for sort of the very mature markets. And that whole importation process requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of working capital, and it's a lot of hassle for distributors to manage. And all of that translates then into, additional costs per product, which is then reflected in the end user pricing, which means that the quality verified products become even more expensive than they were already. So those are sort of the two biggest challenges that distributors face. And I guess there are innovations that can address both of those challenges in quite different ways. And we've been focusing we've been looking at solutions for both of those challenges, but we're currently testing a pilot to kind of crack that second problem.
I mean, so one of the challenges is bringing the price down through financial innovation, right? But also, when you talk about the innovation that you're focused on, what can you specify on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, we wanted to find a way to break this impasse that distributors face, being stuck between these two choices of products, and then see if we can make those products accessible to distributors and therefore their customers. So over the past 6 months, we've been looking at the best-selling non-quality verified products in Kenya to understand their performance and quality, both in the field and in the lab. And we've been working with Verasol to do this. And we wanted to see if there was a sort of sweet spot of products that might not be quality verified, but might actually still be high quality. Interestingly, we did find that these products did exist, and we could just make some small tweaks to some of these best performing products so that they are in fact compliant with Lighting Global quality standards. And even with those tweaks being made, the cost of making those tweaks is quite small. So even if we do those tweaks and we add a 2-year warranty and we add after sales, those tweaked products could be sold at up to 55% cheaper than the average leading quality verified products in the market today with the same specification, so comparable products. So basically we found that there are these kind of sweet spot products that are not sort of quality certified, but could be with minor tweaks and would still be much more affordable for last mile consumers. So now what we're doing is partnering up with a wholesaler in East Africa called Solartech, and we're looking at importing some of these sweet spot products and supplying them to distributors in country, and supplying them with a whole range of sort of value added services. So credit payment terms, warranties, sales and marketing materials. We have low minimum order quantities and so on and so on. So to make them accessible for distributors. So we're quite excited about that. And the lessons, from the pilot are going to be publicly disseminated with the view to enabling other wholesalers and distributors to replicate and scale this model. But it's sort of still early days yet. But I think we were just excited at the first point to find that there are these sort of sweet spot products, but it took us 6 months and a lot of testing to figure out that these products exist. So, you can't expect distributors to be doing that type of work themselves.
And these products that you mentioned, are they energy products specifically coming from Solartech, or are they a variety of products across different sectors?
Yeah, they're off-grid solar products. So they're lanterns and solar home systems.
And this is the pilot in Kenya, or is it Kenya, East Africa, somewhere in
East Africa, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's very exciting. I mean, 55% decrease in retail cost?
Yeah, so the lanterns I think were 25 to 35% cheaper, and then the 3 light systems were between I think 35 and 55% cheaper. We're actually hosting a webinar on this and the findings of this research later today. If people are interested in joining, you can sign up and learn more. What time does that start? Now you're testing me. I think it's 1 p.m. BST.
Okay, great. So Neil from Space 10, hi Neil. He says, have you looked at building more circular value chains? For example, local manufacturing for the energy access space. If not, how could we go about it?
So, I mean, so this isn't something that like we have looked at in a really meaningful way. I mean, I think we are interested in the problem of e-waste, and I think because the biggest barrier to improving e-waste management is about taking back products from consumers at end of life, distributors do tend to fall under the spotlight because they're the ones who are closest to the end consumer. But I think, you know, we all know this needs to be sort of a sector-wide effort. It can't fall on any one part of the value chain. And through our innovation challenge, you know, we are looking at supporting the emergence of digital tools to manage e-waste, which is an area where innovation is needed. So we could be playing a bit more of a role in that space moving forward, but it's not something we've done a lot on right now. I mean, I think it's clearly important to figure out the right incentives for customers and for distributors, and I think we're interested in exploring it a bit more, but not something that we've been very active in to date.
Okay, great. So a reminder to put any questions that you have into the Q&A at the bottom of your screens if you have any additional questions. So maybe let's move on to the evolving needs of the last mile customer. Clearly, I mean, it's a very complicated market. I mean, it's you know, we're talking about the bottom of the pyramid here, but the pyramid is many different segments, right? And so when we talk about the last mile consumer, it's not one type of consumer, right? It's a lot of different types of consumers. That said, you know, I'm sure the needs of all of them, depending on the segment that they're from, are evolving. You know, as they move up, the ability to purchase increases, the needs are evolving. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like from your perspective right now. What kind of intelligence are you getting from your companies on the ground in terms of what they need? And there are a number of questions from the listeners on this specific topic. So once we have that overview, it'd be great to dive into those questions as well.
Yeah, so it is, I mean, I think the barriers kind of continue to be the same as the barriers that have been there for a long time. So, I mean, things like the upfront cost of these technologies because of affordability challenges. I mean, that is still a problem, and that problem has only been exacerbated. There are challenges around poor product quality, which has resulted in consumer distrust of these types of products. And there are, you know, a lot of socio-cultural factors as well, which have an impact on adoption. And in the case of, you know, cook stoves, there's a lot of behavior change that goes with products like this. And of course, you know, there is just a lack of access. So consumers just don't have people or retail outlets that they can go to purchase these kinds of products. So I think all those barriers continue to exist with COVID, but just have been exacerbated.
Yeah, well, that was the question that Paresh Patel from Equitable Energy had, which was, you know, specifically what are the barriers? Martin Bellamy from Solopac, which you mentioned earlier, he wants to know how consumer engagement tools can be efficiently applied to additional regions, both languages, including languages and cultures.
So consumer engagement is a very broad term, and it kind of encompasses every single interaction that you have with a customer. And you know, for the vast majority of distributors, consumer engagement really is the core of your business. So when you're talking about consumer engagement tools, I mean, most distributors will use a combination of their own tools developed in-house and then third-party tools developed by partners. And some are digital, so like, you know, your CRM software or your you know, your data collection tools or whatever, and then some aren't. So, you know, if you look, a lot of distributors use kind of marketing content like product catalogs and so on. That's just sort of printed material. So if you're looking at applying these type of tools across regions, I guess, I mean, you've kind of got two ways of doing that. So one is through your partners. So partners provide customization for the tools and the software that they offer. So if you look at, Angaza or TarotWorks, who work with a whole range of distributors and then provide heavy customization and tailoring of those solutions depending on their client. And there are a lot of options for distributors now on the market, and these services are constantly being iterated to adapt to different distribution business models and geographies. And then, the second sort of piece then is around the tools and the resources that distributors develop themselves. And I think really there is potential to for distributors to do more to sort of open source some of these tools so that other distributors can access them and tailor them to their own context. And I know, from our first innovation challenge, one of the innovations that we're supporting that we're excited about is we're working with Mwezi to develop a digital tool to provide sales agent training on solar water pumps, which is a product that not that many distributors are currently selling, but a lot of distributors are very interested in selling. But it's a very, very technical product, and it's a very different product to sell from, the kind of small scale beneficial products that distributors mostly sell at the moment. So we're working with Mwezi to develop this app and then open source it so that other distributors can use it as well. So either way, it's more efficient for distributors to either work with partners or to adapt another distributor's consumer engagement content than to develop the tools themselves from scratch. So I think we're keen to see more of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It raises a question for me. It sort of goes back to the whole notion of an Amazon for this sector. These are companies at the end of the day who often, as you said, are non-competitive, right? Because they've got their own territories. So I guess it makes sense that you would be willing to open source an app like that. But is there a future in which there could be some sort of roll up of distributors across different regions, different cultures? The question is, it's a good one because the consumer is different in every community, and could a company raise financing to acquire a network of distributors in different markets, or is that not something that you see as likely?
No, I do think that is possible. The market is just so nascent that feels quite far away. But in saying that, we have had glimpses of that in the sector already. So we know that Pollinate Group in India, which caveat is the last mile distribution company that I co-founded, acquired another last mile distribution company in Nepal, Empower Generation, 2 years ago. And that has been really effective, actually, and has kind of taken the best of both companies, and has changed the way that both companies operate, but has absolutely been a good result, and I think has set an example for the sector of what is possible. It's quite a unique story. And they were incredibly closely aligned, and the founder of Empower Generation was looking for an exit. So all the stars kind of came together and aligned, but I think it showed that it is possible. We have also seen, Greenlight Planet has bought up a couple of distributors, like Global Cycle Solutions in Tanzania. So we're seeing that manufacturers are coming into the space and buying up distribution companies. So we've seen it happen a little bit. It hasn't sort of happened in the way that we've seen it happen in the bigger off-grid space with multinationals sort of really stepping in and buying up companies. But I think it is where the sector could go in the future. But what needs to happen first is we really need to see sort of proof of viability in the last mile distribution sector before there's going to be interest in buying these companies. And I think we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, good. So Nina from PowerGen and Oscar from Phoenix had similar questions about customer financing and payback. So essentially they want to know, what are the challenges around consumer financing and strategies to increase payback and reduce default?
So something that surprised me from the State of Sector report was how low default rates are among last mile distributors. And should caveat that the data we have in the State of the Sector report is self-reported from companies, but the average reported default rate was 8%, and the range was from 0 to about 35%. And that is low, and there isn't really much public data or any public data around PayGo default rates, but I mean, anecdotally, average default rates in PayGo world are more like kind of 30 or 40%. So we don't sort of see the same challenges in the last mile distribution sector. And I mean, I think one of those reasons is because distributors tend to sell lower cost products on shorter payment plans. But there are still challenges around customer repayments, because you are talking about very poor customers who have unpredictable income, and there's issues around seasonality of income. And also, in markets where mobile money isn't as prolific, distributors are dependent on cash repayments, which means they actually have to have face-to-face contact with the customer to get that money repaid, and that can be really hard to do. So, I mean, distributors have a whole range of sort of strategies to increase payback. I mean, the starting point is obviously having quality products with quality customer service, because when you have high satisfaction with a product, people don't have a reason not to pay back. But distributors play around a lot with providing the right incentives to sales agents, so making sure that incentives are tied to repayment collection and not just to upfront sales. Distributors are often very flexible in the payment plans that they offer. They do a lot of group loans that leverage peer pressure. And I know that Zonful Energy in Zimbabwe, they have quite a clever strategy of setting aside a percentage of the money that they collect from customers for community projects. So, if you don't pay, your whole community loses out. And they've got a repayment rate of almost 100%, and credit that strategy to for that very, very high repayment rate. So yeah, I think a whole range of strategies that distributors can deploy, but as I say, it's not the same challenge that it is in other parts of the sector.
Yeah, so not a huge issue. From Joe Rafalowitz, a former Power for Aller and now with Save the Children, he wants to ask, considering the importance of PayGo and last mile distribution, especially in East Africa, are the current PayGo business models sustainable? That's a good one.
That is a good one, and a controversial one.
And controversial, yes.
I mean, so we need to be very clear on how we define PayGo. And I still don't really know like what the accepted definition is of PayGo in the sector, but many companies provide consumer financing, whether that's cash-based repayments or mobile money-enabled repayments to end customers. And some of those companies use tech-enabled PayGo, which means the product can be monitored and switched off remotely, but many don't. So I think when we talk about PayGo, often people mean it to be that kind of tech-enabled PayGo, but I mean, generally, I think it's more useful to talk about consumer financing models more broadly. And when we think about PayGo models, we tend to think about the big vertically integrated companies. So guys like Mcopa and Bbox, Azuri, and so on, not last mile distributors. But what we're also seeing now is the rise of this second generation of PayGo models. And these are mostly indigenous companies who are specialized distributors, and they're product agnostic. They're not vertically integrated. So I would call these guys last mile distributors. And we have a bunch of these guys in our membership. So
such as
Altec being a good example. I mean, Zonful, I think, is another example. So with regards to how sustainable the business models are, I mean, I think the jury is still out on the sustainability of these first generation PayGo players. We did see some big guys go insolvent in the last year. There are signs that the bubble is deflating. These companies have had a lot of pressure from donors and investors to reach scale fast, and that has created kind of problems in their business models. But I think these lessons are now kind of quite well understood. They're being learned, companies are adapting, and I think funders are, maybe having more realistic expectations about how quickly the sector can be viable. But I think the second generation, it's early days, but I think this is really promising. They've learned a lot of lessons and they have all the advantages of second movers. And because we're seeing the rise of dedicated investment vehicles, so like Venture Builder, and the Angaza and SEMA Distributor Financing Fund, which are specifically focused on investing in Indigenous PayGo companies, I think we are gonna see this part of the sector accelerate pretty quickly. And I think we're hoping that these are the ones who will prove that distribution is bankable. So yeah, as I say, the jury is still out.
Yeah, that's a nice sidestep, Emma. Well done. Yeah. So on the point of, there's some good questions coming in as well that I want to get to in a second from engineer Luman Yika and Ronald Bukulu. So just hang in there for a second. Yeah, what was I going to ask you? I was going to, I mean, so the question of indigenous companies and what's their strength versus the non-indigenous companies? How do you see that? Is there a key difference that you see between the two?
I mean, so I think there is a key difference. I mean, I think the local companies are very, very embedded in local communities, and they do have networks and sort of a cultural understanding that non-Indigenous companies don't. You know, but I do also think that like we need to be a bit careful, because increasingly we are seeing this narrative of, you know, international versus local companies. And I think everyone wants to see more support flowing to local companies. And I mean, we see that among distributors, local distributors have been less able to access all types of capital and have been sort of systematically disadvantaged. But, you know, you also don't kind of want to pit them against each other, because international companies have also played a really important role in the sector. And a lot of the more sort of social enterprise type of companies in our membership, so that's guys like, you know, Solar Aid and Solar Sister and Livelihoods and so on, you know, they've played a key role in proving that there is kind of a willingness to pay among this market, and innovating around business models that work, and then kind of, you know, paving the way for local companies to come in and potentially do it better. But yeah, I as I say, I just think we need to like exercise a bit of caution when we sort of talk about that narrative. But I think local companies do have an edge, and we do now have about 70% of our membership as local companies, and we're seeing that percentage increase, you know, every month.
It's very exciting. Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. Let's try and do these next questions as 30 seconds or less. Do you think so? We can do it.
I'll try.
Okay, so from engineer Lumanika, from Virunga Power, how has encroachment, especially by national utility monopolies, affected isolated distribution service companies, and what is the general outlook for the future?
Oh, I mean, so we don't really hear much from our members about facing competition from national utilities. Our distributors tend to be operating in areas that are very far removed from where the utilities are. So it's not the same as the mini grid sector, where you do have, you know, mini grid companies looking at, you know, new sites that potentially might be connected to the grid in like 2 months' time. It's just not the same story. And also, like, a last mile distribution network is much more portable, because it's not dependent on physical infrastructure. So they can adapt more quickly.
Yeah, a national utility monopoly that thinks about service, maybe an endangered species, I don't know. From Ronald Bukulu from Equatorial Power, would love to understand more on the Zimbabwe company, Zonful, mode of when a consumer doesn't pay and the whole community does. Is there some case study of that somewhere, Emma, that we can point Ronald to?
So we've touched on it in our State of Sector report, but I don't think we went into a huge amount of detail. But if you want to connect with me afterwards, I'm happy to well, I'll have to talk to William, but happy to potentially connect you to William or look at other sort of sources of information about that model. William
being the head of Zonful. Great. So this is a question that we talked about before getting on the call from Ituro Okan from Metacon Engineering, which we didn't really quite know how to understand, but I want to throw it out there anyway, Emma, which is a question about how do you optimize consumer responsibility in rural communities? And I think, in fact, what William's doing with Zonful is almost a method of you know, optimizing consumer responsibility, because there's that sort of community peer pressure element. But do you have any thoughts on, I mean, what is the role of the consumer? Is there a consumer responsibility in all of this to purchase quality products, or, you know, any other form of responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully sort of sure I understand the question, but I mean, I think the responsibility it's the responsibility of the distribution company to be providing quality products and quality service, right? So the responsibility of the consumer is really to follow through with their repayments if they can, and to provide feedback to the company that's serving them so that that company can improve. But that's, again, very dependent on the distribution company having a positive relationship and cultivating the trust that means that the consumer is empowered to provide that feedback. So I would hesitate to put much responsibility on the consumer beyond that.
Fair enough. There's a question from Busisiwe Manabe from Matlung Energy Solutions, which may not be relevant to you, Emma, but it's sort of, we could broaden it a little bit. And he's essentially asking, how does someone like him, an electrical technologist, start helping to bridge the power supply gaps in a country like Malawi? If you were going to give advice to somebody who was thinking about getting into this space, what advice would you have for them? What's the way to make the most impact if someone wants to get involved?
Well, I mean, I would say the best way is really to go and get your hands dirty working with one of these companies on the ground, because I think very quickly you can get a sense of what is having an impact and where the gaps are, and kind of find your feet that way. I think there's no shortage of demand for that skill set. I think it's about figuring out sort of where your interest lies in the sector.
Great. And then from Frank Berg at Enreca, maybe this is a question you can't answer. What electrical distribution design and construction practices can reduce the cost of last mile distribution? So is there any advice there that you have?
No.
What?
I don't think that's a question for me.
Okay, fair enough. And I think we have exhausted all of our questions, Emma, as far as I can tell. So
great.
Yeah, and we're right on time. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and especially thanks to you, Emma, and the GDC. To learn more about what Emma is doing, you can visit her website at globaldistributorcollective.org. As I mentioned earlier, for additional information about Energy Catalyst, the sponsor of this series, and to keep up to date on future episodes of lessons from the Frontline and other events, funding opportunities, and much more, be sure to visit Energy Catalyst at gov.uk. And we will see you all again soon on Lessons from the Frontline. Thanks so much.